to kind of get things going. And then we're going to leave lots of time for questions from the floor as well. So if there's questions of any of the talks that we've had so far, please keep those in mind. And probably about 20 minutes in, 30 minutes in, we'll open it up to the floor for those questions. So to begin, when we're thinking about the place of the church and things like that, one of the things that I was curious about last night, and we don't necessarily need to belabor this point, but thinking about the place of spiritual gifts and thinking about our place within the church, how much of a place should spiritual gifts have in us thinking about, well, I should do this, I shouldn't do that? And how would we go about maybe first of all finding out what our spiritual gifts are, and then how much should those spiritual gifts dictate what we actually do?
That's a good question. In some ways, just I do think we have gifts, and even when we throw in the language of spiritual, I wonder sometimes if maybe we should just talk about gifts, because in a sense, they're all spiritual if they're from God. And it would help us to not, in a sense, spiritualize the world and therefore devalue really good work that may not look or sound, quote unquote, spiritual in some ways. So baking and preparing, for an event like this might not feel like a spiritual gift, but actually it's part of the gift of hospitality, those kind of things. So I would want to broaden it, and like I was saying last night, I really think it's very hard. It's not that it's impossible, but it's very hard to fully recognize some of our gifts and responsibilities without other people speaking into that. So I really would encourage the kind of relationships that then allow people to know us well enough to speak into our lives and help us better discern. But again, I do think I don't want to overplay it either. Like, all of us need to do things that are just kind of difficult at times. And so I don't want over specialization. One of the things that can happen is, if we're in a bigger church, there is more freedom because there's more people, and then in some ways you might be able to lean into that more. But in the history of the world, many churches are 30 people. And so it's kind of helpful to be reminded, like, well, people always have had to do things they may not feel comfortable. So there's some of that. There's always sacrifice. But then having said that, it's good and healthy, I think, for us to figure out personality and gifts.
In thinking about serving in that way, and also thinking about the seasons part, this is something that I've been thinking about. Should we have a gift and then find a church that fits our gifting? Or do we go to the church and say, what does this church need right now? And how can I kind of plug into that?
Well, I really like that question. My honest answer is I think it's actually, we go to the church and then we figure it out. One of the things that surprised me, particularly like as I was doing research for this book, Theology of Christian Life, was that I really do think for the Apostle Paul and I was going to say the New Testament, I actually think much of the Bible, it kind of surprised me to really get into the research and I think the default is the corporate. And there's a sense, even to understand Christian ethics, that the question isn't so much what am I supposed to do, but what does it look like to be the people of God? And then I, as part of that people in a particular situation, what is that calling me to? And so I do think rather than making ourselves front and center and saying, oh, this is who I am, now let me find the church that works, I do think it's nice as a default to say, what is it, if I can find a local community that really believes in God and holds to his word, etc., then I'm called to try and figure out how I fit into that. And I give the primacy to the community rather than primacy to the self. I think there's something really healthy in that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. In some ways, yeah, sorry. The question, if I'm understanding it right, is like, okay, given the emphasis on the corporate, what happens with your disappointment when you feel like you are called or gifted to do something, and whether it's, say, teaching, and they're like, hey, now we need you to be an usher and help with the parking lot. I think our default is to do what the community is calling us to, but over time, if there is that kind of tension, to have those kind of conversations, because sometimes it is like when I talked about when I worked really hard to play the guitar. I wanted to be in front helping lead. It would have been bad if I was up front helping lead. And I needed other people to help me recognize that. But having said that, I do think in the church sometimes we think our job is to make other people humble. And we're like, well, we don't want you doing that thing. You might get arrogant by it or something. We have to be careful about that. So to connect it with some of what we're talking about, I think the first thing I would do is when you feel like you have gifts that are not being used, I would lament to God. I would actually take it to God, and God, like, I think you gave me this. I'm not doing it. I know I'm not doing it perfectly. Maybe I'm tempted towards arrogance or pride with it. But God, I feel like you've given this to me, so I need you to help me have the right attitude and cultivate this gift. And I need you to help others see it so I can practice it. And I would actually pray that for a while. And then at some point, if it's still not recognized, I would have a conversation with the pastor or leaders and be open to that conversation. But I really think it's appropriate to lament, but it still takes the community to recognize these things.
I wonder too, in thinking about that, one of the things is maybe someone might come in and think right out the gate, oh, I'm a good teacher. I should get appointed to this right away because I'm a good teacher. But in humility, coming into a church and becoming a known commodity with that church, being respected, then people might recognize that gift in you, but it might take time, right? And so I think that's too something like when we think about, say, the requirements for deacons or elders, those requirements are based around knowing that person, right? You're not going to appoint someone who comes week one. You're going to see the way they live and then appoint them. And so I wonder too, like with giftings, you might know what your gift is, but it might take a while for that church to recognize it, and being patient in that first year or two, whatever it might be, for then other people to recognize that gift too.
I really appreciate you saying that. I think that's right. And I appreciate even the example of deacons and elders. I do think in a sense, biblically, the church, I'd want to qualify this a little bit, but there is a very real sense in which the church doesn't so much make people deacons and elders. The church recognizes and then honors, and there is a sense in which you make someone a deacon or an elder. But really what you're supposed to be doing is looking for what God is already doing and then going, oh, let's recognize this and let's now give it this official kind of thing. You don't make someone a deacon and say, now we want to see if you'll serve. You're looking for people who are serving in subtle, in these kind of ways. You looking for elders or teachers who are doing these things in small and meaningful ways, who start to get known as wise. But the majority of our gifts are not up in front anyways. Even the gift of teaching, I think probably most of the time, most of the teaching I do is probably very personal, one-on-one kind of stuff. And I did that for many, many years before I was up front.
Are there any questions from the floor that anyone would like to ask? Yeah, Silas.
So first of all, on film it'll be a lot better.
Yeah.
Thank you. I guess first, would you agree that saying the way to practice spiritual gifts, the way to grow spiritual gifts is practicing them? You would agree with that? How would you practice, like some spiritual gifts are hard to practice. Like I'm thinking of particularly the gift of spiritual discernment, because you don't really know how to practice that, because either you're going crazy or you're doing it right. So how would you practice spiritual gifts in general, but also particularly that one?
Yeah, it's thank you, Silas. Part of my hesitation is I'm wondering if by us talking about spiritual, and I know I'm the one who started this, but by talking about the language of spiritual gifts so much, it might distract us in some problematic ways. So I do think we can have the gift of discernment. It does take practice. What that actually looks like, though, is learning through experience, paying attention, entering in with people, and you kind of start to discover when, like anything, when you're getting it right and when you're not. And so you chasten yourself a little bit. Like maybe I was it's too bold when I said that. I acted like I knew more than I did, and I spoke with an authority I actually didn't have, and it wasn't even, I should be careful about that. But in other ways, but I do think even discernment is one of those things, right, where you start to pray and realize prayer is not just a to-do, it's actually just time with God. Mother Teresa used to say, you start praying when you stop talking. And one of the ways you practice discernment is just think about your day and people that you know, think about them with God. And we're like, God, is there anything you want me to say to them? How should I think about them? And I find when I'm really praying, I pray about fewer people because it takes longer. Actually, I can pound through a list like anybody. Like, Lord, be with that person, be with that person. Like, it's great. I can feel good about praying for 50 people. Or you can pray for just a few people and actually spend time with God thinking about their family and some of the dynamics or their unemployment and what's going on and what might contribute to it and other difficulties. And I think sitting with God in those things, with His Spirit, as an example of how you can actually practice discernment, because by being with God, I do think He can bring things to mind and sanctify your imagination in ways that can be helpful to His people. And I think that you can grow at that with time. Yeah.
Maybe a question can pivot a little bit. I was thinking about this. You closed talking about sleep and Sabbath.
Yeah.
And in your discussion of Sabbath, you were very much connecting it to worship, thinking about local church worship. In what ways might someone's day of rest actually potentially look different than, say, on Sunday? One discussion that will come up a lot is, say, like a pastor, right? A pastor works 4 to 6 hours at least on a Sunday. Is that really a day of rest? Do you think that the day of rest and the day of worship should be the same, generally speaking, or could you see those as separate days as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it tends to be more specialized for the pastors. I do think that there is something in particular about corporate worship and how it fits in. So I still, in a sense, want to say there's something about, and even it's interesting, even when we say Sunday, which I often do, but in a Jewish Sabbath, it's evening to evening, right? So even that is kind of interesting, that in some ways that rest can begin Saturday night and go through Sunday night. And maybe one Sunday after that, Sunday night, one's preparing for Monday. I'm just not interested in the legalism part. And so I do think that is normal. However, if your paid employment, like a pastor or someone on staff in a church, means that you are actually doing a lot of work on that, then I definitely think you also need another day of rest, of non-work in that way. But the hesitation you're getting is, even in that case where I do think pastors should have a day off that's not Sunday, it's not healthy if a church treats Sunday as if it's a day off for pastors and staff. That's not good. But having said that, it's still not like any other day. There's Sunday, even for pastors, is still different, I think, because of how God has made us than other days.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find difficult for our culture today is like, what is rest actually? And when you were thinking, the first talk you were talking about, for many people, rest is like binging on Netflix,
right.
But that doesn't actually provide rest. For some, going to church on a Sunday morning might not actually feel restful, especially for people, maybe you serve on the music team and you're volunteering for 6 hours, whatever, right? So what would be some practices that you would encourage to put in place for thinking about rest rather than just, watching TV or whatever, but restful things?
Yeah, I do think it's interesting because rest can mean different things. And part of what's going on, even with Sabbath, is often, or we talk about sabbaticals, they're actually normally ceasing to do one kind of activity in order to do another. And so caring for the poor, caring for the ox in the ditch, can be an expression of rest even as it's work. And so I do think we have to be careful that we don't end up making a day of rest selfish, even as we do recognize we do physically, emotionally, etc. need rest. And some of this stuff is hard because it's very cultural. We spent some good time with your pastor over the last 24 hours, and my wife and I lived in the UK for 3 years, and when we got to London, we were part of this church that it was an Irish pastor, and it was a very traditional church or whatever. And so we get there, and on Sunday, his family invited us for lunch. So we went to church, and then they had like a Sunday school, and then we went to their house for lunch. And all of a sudden, you realize, Thanksgiving in America is basically like every Sunday traditionally in Britain. You're like, oh, this is what we would have at Thanksgiving, right? And they were very traditional. They would do this big feast, and you had this great lunch, and then next thing you know, you're having tea together, and then you're like, well, you should just stay until the evening worship service. And to be honest, it sounds so bad, but my wife and I, after like the first Sunday, we're like, oh no, this is not good. We were so exhausted by Sunday, but it was so restorative to them, but absolutely not to us. We need to get home and take a nap, literally. So I think we rest in one another, but there are some cultural expressions where for a lot of people that is so restful and rejuvenating to be with these people that you, in the midst of your busy lives, haven't been. So I don't want to give hard and fast rules. I know that it shouldn't be selfish. I know that physical rest needs to be honored, but there is this call to corporate worship and different rhythms and some of that.
Great. Any questions?
All the way in the back.
There was a speaker a couple of years ago here who said, if you, which resonated with me, if you work with your mind, Sabbath with your body, and if you work with your hands or your body, Sabbath with your mind.
Yep.
And so just on the concept of, I apologize, I've been in and out, so if you already spoke to this, I'm sorry. So it shouldn't be selfish, but maybe, what if, like, for you, rest is not necessarily, if you're like closet introvert, and
Yeah.
it's kind of actually getting away from people.
Yes.
And some, maybe even like some degree of physical, like going for a bike ride or a run or something. Is that sort of breaking the concept of physical rest, even though for you that's restorative?
No, I love what you said, and I totally agree with whoever said that in terms of, I do, and I love both the idea of like, if you work with your mind, rest your mind. If you work with your body, rest your body. If you're an extrovert, what rest looks like is different than an introvert. And as you probably know, like the definition, people think extrovert means you do a lot of like expressive things. Technically, extroversion and introversion, the difference is, where do you recharge? Do you recharge by being with people? Do you recharge by being... an introvert can like people. It's not that they don't like people. It's just they need to... And I know in my own life, on some of those personality things, before I became a teacher, I was on the more extroverted side. And then 6 years into teaching, all of a sudden, we realized just how much I changed, where because I was in front so much, I really needed to, those, like you're saying. So for me, like on Sunday, a great Sunday is when I can sneak off and go for like an hour walk all by myself. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Can everyone just stop? No, it is. It's one of those interesting things. If you're a counselor, Monday through Friday or Saturday, whatever, if you do a lot of counseling during your day, the idea of doing a bunch of counseling on Sunday is very hard. If you're in the business world and you find yourself in Sunday getting to have these deep, meaningful conversations about people's lives and brokenness, it can be I've seen it be so life-giving to people where they're like, oh, there's meaning and purpose in life. That same conversation could be very meaningful or very difficult. Just to go back to complete what you originally said, so because I'm a professor, I love on Sunday if I can work in my yard and garden. That's wonderful. But if you're a landscaper for a living, my guess is you should not be working in your yard on Sunday. It's an interesting thing. So that's where I'm like, I'm just so not interested in legalism, but I am interested in God made us with this rhythm. So what does that look like? And I do think our communities can help us navigate that.
And I think part of it too, balancing community and also alone time. And if anyone's listened to the podcast, this is a quote I've mentioned a few times, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he says, beware the one that can't be in community to not be alone, and beware the one that's alone to be in community, right? Basically balancing, you need both community and alone time. And I think one of the great illustrations of this is Jesus, right? Jesus is ministering with the people, and then he runs off and has alone time early in the morning. They're looking for him. Where is he? He should be doing stuff, but he needs that time. And I think it's not selfish if it's being done for rejuvenation in order that you can return and minister to the people.
That's right.
So there's actually, in the Christian life, needing a balance between those two. Times of being alone, but times of being in community as well.
Yeah, it's great. And maybe to connect it with one of the earlier questions, it just made me think about this. One of the things I found very interesting, getting back to some of the challenge with understanding gifts, is I've met some people who are accountants, for example, and very good at it, who've been frustrated by the church because they're good at accounting. The way the church wants to utilize them is always in accounting. And they're like, actually, I would love to be in children's ministry, or I want to help with the grounds, or whatever, right? And so I do think we need to both be attentive, but be in that conversation, because we shouldn't just assume. Now, I've also known accountants who are like, no, I have this gift and I want to use it for the good of the church. So I don't think there's clear rules, but it is this conversation, and we shouldn't just make it the exact same.
Good. Another question?
So to build on that, how do we had today someone under 16 and someone over 80 win a book? And yet it seems often in our churches, going back to last night, how you have seasons, you have different types of trees maybe that are bearing fruit in different seasons. Some sprout really fast and some take a long time. And yet it seems like our church relegates the work to 30 to 50-year-olds and overworks them. And 100%. We want perfection. We get frustrated with a bad screen or a bad mic. How do we do a better job as a church to integrate the young, the old, to be one body?
So great. This is a really interesting problem. And I don't know how it's affecting you guys up here in North, but I can tell you certainly in America, one of the challenges is people don't want to give up power. And so people aren't retiring, people aren't giving up positions, and part of what's happening is mentoring's not happening. And I love how you said, how do we, because we expect perfection. Well, part of it is mentoring means you let people do things when they screw it up. I can't remember what I was telling you guys last night at dinner, but my story, when I became a Christian in high school, there was a guy who had 1 year of Bible college and dropped out. He was actually from Canada and moved, and he was a landscaper. So he had 1 year of the equivalent of upper education, dropped out, landscaper, and there were 4 of us guys who were all teenagers who didn't really come from Christian families. And he would just buy a book for each of us, the same book, and we would all meet at his house once a week and just talk about it chapter by chapter. And it wasn't him teaching us. It was taking us seriously and having us, and I think it's very interesting because sometimes I think about things we said. It was just crazy, right? I was telling my students the other day, I was in high school, and at one point, because I was totally evangelizing stuff, and I had like 30 kids, teenagers, in my house, in my bedroom one night with candles serving the Lord's Supper. I'll just tell you, I think that's really bad theologically. But I was like, yeah, let's do it. I didn't know any better, right? But in some ways, that was really important, right? For me to start to learn. And people poured into me and to others. And so I do think we need to be honoring all of these seasons and constantly pulling. I had this pastor one time, he called me, and I started talking to him on the phone. He said, Kelly, my wife says I need to have you come talk to our church leadership. They were in a different city, a different part of the country. He said, my wife said I need to invite you to come speak to our leadership, and I told her no. Because I told her if Kelly comes, no one's going to do anything. Because I'm going to tell them to rest, right? And so we were joking about it. But I understood his fear, because it's exactly what you're saying. In most organizations, including the church, 15 to 20% of the people do all the work, or the majority of the work. And pastors and other organization members are going to tell you that's not good for the people or the organization. But what's very difficult is we see things that have to be done, and if you're in that 20%, you tend to have a personality where you see it, you're like, I got to do it, and it's very hard for us to not. But part of it takes courage to say there is a legitimate need. I can't do it. You create a vacuum. People hate a vacuum, and they will fill it. But to use the church as an example, because 15, 20% can't do all the work. And so if we go, okay, we can't do all that, you guys are doing too much and we're burning you out. And it's actually better for the people not participating to start participating. So we're going to create this. If something that needs to be done, no one's stepping up, then at some point you have to ask the hard question, do we really need it? And those are because what's interesting is you get a lot of people who don't participate who will get angry if you stop doing the thing. And you're like, well, and then I do think it becomes like, no, we actually really do need everybody. And if we could even get it to 50% of the people, it'd be transformative. But it's very uncomfortable to get to that, because you have to function less like a professional organization and more like a family. Where your kids, you know this, like if you have kids, it's way faster to empty the dishwasher yourself than to teach an 8-year-old. But it's way better to teach the 8-year-old and to say, everybody in this family participates. You're going to clean a toilet and you're going to screw it up. But no, that's what we're going to do.
I wonder too, I think one aspect of the non-mentorship is I have power, I don't want to relinquish that to others. But the other side of it I've actually noticed is the opposite, where older people have a lot of insecurity, thinking there's nothing a young person would want from me. There's nothing beneficial. Yes. So I wonder, how do you address that? Because I think, working with young adults, it's very common that young adults will say, I want to be mentored. Yes. But also they're not likely to just go up to an older person and ask for it. So how might you help someone, address those insecurities for stepping into mentorship? It's
such a funny reality about all of us. Sometimes I tell administrators in colleges and universities, like, you need to remember when you're dealing with college faculty or seminary faculty, you're dealing with profound arrogance and profound insecurity. And arrogance and insecurity are two sides of the same coin. And it is interesting that we think teenagers, who often do deal with insecurity, but you can be 80 and feel insecure. And one of the interesting phenomena I've realized is, so in a college environment, one of the things that's become very clear to me talking to a lot of alum, is when they're in college, they're walking across campus, they're hugging each other, they're rolling around on the grass. They, 6 of them are sitting on a small couch together. It's very normal, right? And then all of a sudden they graduate and they're supposed to be grown-ups working in the professional world. And if you're really grown up, you maybe have your own place or something. And I have had all these alum tell me, it is brutal. They all of a sudden realized they'll go not just days, sometimes weeks without physical touch. And they didn't even know they needed it, which also makes them super vulnerable to inappropriate touch. And it's the same thing with conversation. So I'll often say, in your church, look for these gray heads that have been walking with Jesus for a long time. And it's super uncomfortable, but just ask, is there any way I can have coffee with you? Because the older person, their life is enriched by this younger person. And the opposite. It's been amazing to me, sometimes very different personalities I'll see come together, and the beautiful relationships that come through this are stunning. That's really, really healthy on both sides. And it's not, by the way, because the older person is just so righteous and perfect. To be honest, sometimes I've seen the uncomfortable thing where the 24-year-old's like, I love this woman. I call her Aunt whatever now. She struggles with racism. Well, and you can help her. And she can help you because you have different sins. And so it's not that this person is so perfect they're going to help. Like, you actually can help each other. And it's one of those beautiful, I think, part of how God made us.
Great. Other questions? Yeah, Ariel up front here.
One of the questions I have for you is, we're not meant to do it all, but what do you do in situations where doors keep opening for you? And you're like, oh, that's like something that I am passionate about, or that's something that I know God has gifted me in, and that doors just keep opening, and then your calendar keeps filling up. So how do you navigate those situations, discern what I'm actually supposed to be doing?
That's a great question. I think what's interesting is it's really good. We can be proud of ourselves when we stop saying yes to do bad things. Mediocre things is even better. The maturity and the hard part comes when we learn to say no to the good things. And the answer, I know I sound like a broken record, becomes I think it takes the community to help us discern. Because sometimes, like, my wife will say something that I think is like the greatest and something else is good, and she's like, for various reasons, you should say yes to that good thing and no to that thing that seems even better. And maybe it's community obligations, maybe it's how it's going to affect the family. But I do think a sign of maturity is actually learning to say no to really beautiful, good things that even I care about. And certainly, I'm in a season of life where that's happening, and it's starting to go like, oh, that's great. And for me, one of the things I've learned is to go, that's a great opportunity. I would love to do it. I can't. I now go, oh, who do I know that could do that? And I now can recommend someone, which then enriches their lives and that community, because I often know they're going to do as good or better a job than I would have. And then all of a sudden, now it's not about Kelly, it's this larger thing. So I do think learning to just, with others, figure out it's okay to say no even to beautiful, important things. And then don't just say no, but are there others that you think could do this? And now you're getting back to, we're mentoring, we're cultivating. It's not just about the individual needs to be the hero.
Good. There's another one.
I think you answered my question partly 2 questions ago, but I'm interested in what your advice would be to a smaller church, say like 30 to 100 people, where there's all kinds of things to do. People still want to have a Sunday school. They still want to have ministries. How do you function in a church like that where there's so many needs and yet not burn out?
Yeah. My guess is, given what you just asked, you're probably more qualified to answer that than me. But part of part of what I have found, part of what's beautiful about smaller churches like that is everyone kind of knows that they have to do it, right? Because in a bigger church, you sit in the back, you come and go, no one really notices. In a small church, it's kind of like, hey, chairs need to be spread out for this church service. Everyone should grab a chair and do it. But I do think you end up with some difficult conversations where it's like, that's a really potentially great ministry or thing, like a Sunday school, and we can't do it. Even in my church, which is a bigger church, one of the things, you know, I teach Sunday school and stuff. One of the things we've done, which I'm really thankful, is we don't do Sunday school year round because it was just too burdensome for people. And so we've created some seasons where we do it and then we don't. And so I don't know what it looks like, but I do think the community, part of it is just like we have to with our bodies, we have to be honest about what we've got, including our energy levels. And somehow put the weight of the decision on the people, not just on the pastor. Because what happens is people get frustrated that not everything's happening and they blame the pastor. And I do think if there's a way to say, this is us as a community, this is how many people we got. So guys, how do we do this? What do we say? What do we say yes to and no to? And the more it can be a communal kind of thing that then the leadership is leading in, the healthier that can be. But again, I think you're probably more qualified than I am.
I think another piece to that too is also different sized churches need to operate differently.
Yeah.
And a smaller church can't look at a bigger church and say, we're just going to replicate that. And also vice versa.
Yeah.
A large church can't look at a small church and say, we just got to replicate that. So trying to, within each local congregation, figure out what works for us, right? Not just trying to mirror another church.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, one of the fascinating things I see is like in a big church, people are like, why doesn't the pastor know me or something like that? And you're like, you know, if you go to a church with 50 or 100 people, you will be known and the pastor will be at your hospital. Yeah. If you're in a church with 800 people, I mean, there are pastors who are that gifted who can, but the average, it's interesting, average studies is a church for every 100 to 150 people, you actually do need another person because you are maxed out in terms of any kind of even knowledge of names and all of that. So it isn't just a small church. It is, people are like, I want all the benefits of the big church and I want the small church feel. And they're mad at the big church for being big. So.
James has a question up here.
I just wanted to ask, just because I was thinking about reflections on, if you took spiritual disciplines in my master's, you get the benefit of studying church history, and you look at the heroes that we often put forward in our lives in church history, and many of them, you would not look at them, and you look at their families or their work life and things like that. Like think of John Wesley or others on this thing, and we would not be talking about this kind of topic and saying these guys, these men and women, were examples of a lot of rest and things like that. In many ways, sometimes they worked themselves to death, or even their marriages were not healthy and things like that. I'm just wondering about, do we need a different set of heroes?
Yes.
Or why do we, in some ways, how can you still live out the urgent mission and not, like you guys, and not a harried existence?
Yeah.
But we see most of the time in church, we seem to lift up those who predominantly seem to live a harried existence.
Yeah.
If you look at Spurgeon and others of how much they actually slept at night and things like that. So.
Yeah, I think who we make heroes tells us a lot about ourselves. And even those stories we tell about them. And even when we think about deep spirituality, it's very, because I work in this area, and I've made it a matter of principle for myself when I'm writing or speaking, and I'm talking about what does a spiritual life look like, or what should it look like. I honestly now try and remember, okay, here's the test case. how does this work out for a Christian who's a single mom with 3 children at home, all under 5? And how does this work out for the Christian who's materially poor and maybe homeless? Because part of what happens when we think of spirituality is we'll think of like the monastic life or something, or it's an upper middle class life, and it's there is something that's problematic about that. So whatever it means to be faithful to God and spiritually mature, I think it's got to be something that a single mom with 3 kids could do. And so what I do, this is where I think faithfulness is a very interesting thing. And sometimes the stories, we need to be more honest about some of the brokenness. Wesley is quite a good example, and we could list more and more of those. And in particular, evangelical missionaries are some of the most brutal when you look into them. And I talk about some of those examples in the book. And so I do want us to be very careful. I remember, this was a doozy. I remember hitting this. And this wasn't so much, well, anyways. Have you ever heard of A.W. Tozer? Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you something terrible, but I am going to tell you something sober. So Tozer, who wrote these really wonderful, insightful things, he was very devoted to God, very, very deep spirituality. When he died, his wife ended up marrying someone else. And when asked about it later, she said, well, A.W., he loved God, and my second husband loves me. I mean, just heartbreaking. And when you look into the reality of his life, like he spent all this time in prayer and all these things, but actually, and he was trying to be generous, but the reality was he was literally impoverishing his own family and making their life this incredible difficulty that he could live kind of ignoring. And so it looked, and I do think he thought he was doing right, but it was really problematic. And if a spouse says something like that, I think there are at least some honest questions we should have. So I'm very interested in models for us on spirituality that are very mundane, because that's where most of us do live. And again, we sacrifice in these kind of things, but I think it's a challenge. Luther was a mess. I love Luther. Here's what, maybe put it this way. Every couple of years, I will read a new biography of Luther and C.S. Lewis and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I love all 3 of them, but part of the reason why I will read new biographies of them every year is because they're all super weird. And if you don't know about them, you don't know that. But even Lewis, totally weird. He's a brilliant writer because he's observing. He's very observant, but he's just himself kind of weird. There's just trust me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, brilliant. I drew on him yesterday. There's some weird stuff, right? Martin Luther, he's hilarious because he's kind of buzzed half the time. He's drinking, right? So, and I think there's something really beautiful about recognizing some of the foibles and failings, so we don't. I think, when you mentioned Bonhoeffer and Life Together, Bonhoeffer has this great line also where he's basically, the enemy of community is those who romanticize community. Because people love to talk about community and actually hate people, right? Dostoevsky has this great line where he talks about, basically the same thing where people love to talk about community, but you put them in a room with someone for 24 hours, and by the end, the way they're breathing and stuff, they want to kill that person. But they wax eloquent about people in generic land. So anyways, I'm kind of rambling now, but.
Maybe also, too, an encouragement. There are some church history folks that did have a good balance as well, right? So there's examples of people to learn negatively and positively from. Yeah.
And even the bad, quote unquote, bad examples were a good part. Like Luther and Katie Luther were this beautiful marriage. And part of what was beautiful is it wasn't perfect. It was very earthy, right? And that's why I actually love in the imperfection, like all of us are the imperfection. Yeah.
And that comes back to the vulnerability piece too, earlier that you're talking about, that we should recognize these heroes also had faults, right? And same with us. We should recognize the faults that are in our own life.
Yeah, when I first became a Christian, I read a bunch of these, what we call hagiography. I didn't know that's what it was called, but these romanticized, particularly Christian missionaries and stuff. And now, if I start reading one of those, I literally want to vomit, right? Because part of my family story, dealing with a lot of pain and suffering, I just cannot handle plastic Christianity. I need authentic, messy, tell me the reality of what this person is like, because it's not what you're saying. Yeah.
Good. Question over here.
This might be a little bit of a broad question depending on the person, but as a student, I don't do a lot of like work, but depending on the week, depending on extracurriculars and tests, whatever, I've got a lot of like homework and other stuff that needs to be done. So I'd just be curious as to what you think rest would look like for a student.
Yeah. Well, I do think that's work. You're just not being paid for it. No, I that is funny, but I actually kind of mean it. One of the things that's happened, and I think it's probably happening this side of the border as well, is now when we say the word work, we actually don't even realize we default think paid, which does undermine things like raising children, helping out at church. Only things that count as work are things you're paid for. When the reality is, as a student, you're not paid. When you help out at church, you're not paid, and that's good work. And part of working 6 days is not getting paid 6 days, it's doing work. I remember when my wife and I, even before we had kids, we were both working, and we're like, when do we do laundry? And we still both work, by the way. But we had to figure something, like, because laundry is work, and it's good work. But when we have economies that are structured in such a way that the mighty dollar is asking for more and more, we now are reducing work to getting paid, and our employers want everything from us so that when we're not getting paid, we're just exhausted. And the reality is, if the only work you and I do is what we're paid for, our lives are falling apart, right? We can't keep up. So getting back to your question about, as a student, I find it interesting that my college students who start to buy into the Sabbath are way more, quote unquote, strict about it than I am. For them, once they've tasted this idea, they are protective of it. And I think there are times where it's really important to learn to say, I'm going to do work until this time and then I'm done on a night. Because you know how it is. If you don't do something like that, you will drag it out because it's so exhausting and overwhelming. And so work that might take you an hour, it takes 3 because you're getting distracted or whatever. But if you're like, I'm not doing any more homework after 8. You do your best. Anyways, I do think you have to sometimes create artificial lines to give yourself some rest, to do different things.
Good. I think there's another question. Yeah, right here.
Great. I'm Andrew. Just a question about, I can't remember where the quote's from, but something about if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. And I think I read it in a book with respect to sort of phone usage and distraction and things like that. And yesterday you mentioned in the first session something about phones, and it sounded like there was a bit of a nugget beneath there that you didn't quite want to get into that session. I'm just kind of wondering what you've found with respect to phone usage and social media and things like that in the context of your research.
Yeah. Even in the last 5 years, I can say this now more strongly than I could have 5 years ago, and this is really going to shock you guys. But social media is bad for you. It's not shocking, I know. Like, there's so much data now. It's staggering. And at first, actually, and it's not just social media. It's larger than that. But, like, it was the first to hit in terms of the accumulating data was teenage women, for example, really hurt by this, how it affected their body image, the increase in self-harming, etc. part of what's interesting is some of the newer research is really bad for the mental health of young women. Some of the surprise has been not just social media, but the equivalent of that kind of distraction, often gaming and stuff. For young men, which is still the distraction part, the young women really screws them up, but after high school or early college, they often kind of figure some things out and get a little bit more stable, even though it can be more extreme and more dangerous for them earlier on. It now seems like the research is young men have more lingering difficult consequences. Not just with obvious things like when they get into pornography, but one of the really big things is gaming and all of that, and the equivalent of like a social media thing. It is a way to escape. And so you're not spending all these hours building normal relationships. You're not spending normal hours actually physically moving. You're not using normal hours to do some of the things you would traditionally do, which is now fostering the idea that someone can be 28 years old and still living in a basement of their parents, playing a lot of games, and just not, quote unquote, growing up. And this idea of what's called the delayed adolescence is a real issue. So social media, I do think, like, just to be honest with you, like publishers for over a decade have said, you've got to be on social media. And we really, and over COVID, we really wrestled to it. And we just still just said no. So I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Instagram. And by God's grace, it's worked out. And the one agreement was, so now I have a website, kellykapic.com, and it's because they said, you've got, and I said, they said, it's static, not Diana. So I never have to check it, except that's where people fill out a form to invite me to speak. But there's something, but that I don't check, I don't do any of that because I really, now someone here earlier during one of the breaks, they said they actually got to Grandview and had their faith renewed, Christian faith renewed through Instagram or something like that. So I really do, God uses those things for good. I know of people who've become Christians through things like TikTok. So I don't want to, but just to be honest with you, I just think there is growing evidence that shouldn't surprise any of us these days that this is not good for us. And I'm not great about this, partly because I like my phone to listen to books and stuff. So even on Sunday, I will often use it. But I do really respect people who are like, I'm not. I'll tell you one other thing, so we can all feel bad about ourselves together. Last time I was here, what was it, 3 years ago or something like that? And it was like a conference on anxiety. And I went out to the lobby during one of the breaks, and this young couple, they had a baby or two. And I remember they're on the side, and they said, hey, will you come here? They're like feeding one of their kids. And I'll never forget this. They said, we're not perfect with our phones, but my wife and I, we've really worked hard. When we get home, we kind of set them aside because we're with the kids now and everything. I'll never forget, they said, but you know who's terrible? They said, when the grandparents come over, this is out in the lobby here 3 years ago. The grandparents come over, they'll be on the couch with their feet out, and the grandchild is playing 3 feet from their feet, and the whole time the grandparents are looking at their phones. And that, talk about Brene Brown, once you see something, you can't unsee it. And ever since then, I've started to talk about that in different settings, and I hear it again and again and again and again. So I think sometimes we comfort ourselves like, this is a teenager problem. It is not a teenager problem. This is an us problem. And we are in people's presence undermining those relationships. And all of us need to be downplaying our phones. Like you're going to see, rather than blaming young people are going to be the ones help us out of this. The young people are the ones who are gray screening their phones. The young people are the ones who are like where I teach. I don't know if you've ever heard of a brick. My daughter has a brick, and everybody in the dorm uses it. They want each other's help. Someone will have the code to their phone so they can't. My son, who's married, does not have a web browser on his phone. Those young people, because they've lived all the crap, are going to be the ones to help us get out of this. It's not going to be us.
I think we have time for one more. So, Faye?
I was reading something the other day that caused me to think about something. He said, we define ministry to people who are paid in the church.
Yes, yep.
Something that we do in the church, and then we go and live our lives.
Yeah.
And he defined ministry as living a life that is pleasing to God. So how can we take the things that we learn, and because we're Christians, I'm thinking about, what am I doing? Am I doing it well?
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. How do we merge those two locations into being one? Because there really is no secular versus ministry. Have you got any comment?
Yeah. Yeah, there is a real sense in which we need to baptize our entire lives, right? And it's interesting. I really try now. I'm not always great about it. But you know how sometimes we'll ask, like, how are you doing? And then we might follow up with, like, but how are you doing spiritually? And we just need to stop that. Because how you're doing is how you're doing spiritually. Whether your answer is physical or your job or your church relations or your family or your kids, it's all spiritual, right, in that sense. And so I do think one of the things that's very important for us is to baptize going to the workplace and working with little kids. And when we're teaching a Sunday school or cleaning a toilet at church or just greeting people at the door to going to be a school teacher, like this is all life lived before and with God. And until we do that, we think the whole point of jobs that get paid is I need to do this to have money to give to the church and so I can just live. Rather than like, no, the Creator really loves His creation, and you and I as Christians are seeking to bring order and goodness in the midst of a broken world. And that order and goodness could be you creating code for a good program. It could you being really good at accounting in order to allow things to function well. And that's all very, very spiritual. And I agree, we've just got to be a little careful about spiritualizing some things and not others. So.
Great. Okay, can we give a round of applause for
Thank
Dr.
you, guys.
Kapic?
Yep. Thank you.
And we now have some spare time to go to the bookstore. Some of you haven't bought books yet, so go and buy some books. And we'll have lunch at 12 o'clock downstairs in the gym.